Brad Pitt was originally cast in The Shawshank Redemption, but dropped out just before filming. The movie was almost directed by Rob Reiner, with Tom Cruise as Andy and Harrison Ford as Red. And did you know Morgan Freeman's famous voiceover narration had to be re-recorded after a serious technical issue? Despite these changes, the film became a timeless classic. Watch till the end to know other secrets you missed about this legendary movie. They will shock you. The Shawshank Redemption is often hailed as one of the greatest movies ever made, but even the best films aren't immune to fan questions. One of the most famous questions has always been about Andy Dufresne's escape. Specifically, how did he manage to put the poster back in place after crawling through the tunnel? Fans have scratched their heads over this scene for years, thinking it must be a plot hole. Well, according to Tim Robbins, the actor who played Andy, there's a simple answer. In a reunion with Morgan Freeman at the TCM Film Festival, Freeman brought up the famous question, asking Robbins, how did Andy get that poster back in place after he crawled into the tunnel? Robbins didn't hesitate, answering with, "This is so easy." Using hand gestures to illustrate, he explained that Andy only pinned the top of the poster, leaving the bottom free to lift. Robbins mimed how Andy would have pulled the bottom of the poster up, crawled underneath, and then left the poster hanging naturally once inside the tunnel. Simple, right? It's one of those moments where, once explained, it seems obvious, but it had stumped fans for years. But the truth is, even after multiple viewings, there are still things many fans haven't noticed or figured out. One of the most memorable moments in the movie is the enduring friendship between Andy and Red. At one point, Andy asks Red why people call him that. Red's response, "Maybe it's because I'm Irish," always gets a smile. But did you know that this joke has deeper roots? In Stephen King's original novella Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, Red actually is an Irishman. Director Frank Darabont wanted Morgan Freeman for the role so badly that he changed Red's background entirely. The joke is a wink to the book's version of Red, and it's one of those little nods that most people miss. Another interesting detail comes from Darabont's own involvement in the film's production. Sometimes directors step in for small moments, and that's exactly what happened here. For certain close-up shots of Andy's hands, Darabont took over for Tim Robbins. In particular, Darabont himself handled the scenes where we see Andy loading a revolver and carving his name into the cell wall. It's a small detail, but one that shows just how involved Darabont was in bringing his vision of Shawshank to life. While The Shawshank Redemption is known for its powerful story and moving performances, it's also famous for being, well, a bit lacking in female characters. Of course, the story is set in a men's prison, so that makes sense, but it's still striking just how few women appear in the entire film. In its 2.5-hour runtime, there are only 2 female-speaking roles. One is a woman who complains about Brooks's service at the grocery store, and the other is the bank employee who helps Andy after his escape. That's it. For a film that is so sprawling and emotional, it's unusual to have such little involvement from female characters, but that's just the nature of the story. Speaking of Shawshank's reach, the movie became a huge hit on television, but it wasn't always so successful. When it was first released in theaters, The Shawshank Redemption didn't do well at all. It bombed at the box office, and despite being nominated for 7 Academy Awards, it didn't win a single one. It wasn't until after it was released on video that it started to gain a real following. And a big part of its success came from Ted Turner, who sold the broadcast rights of the film to TNT at a very low price. That's why the movie seemed to be on TV constantly in the 90s. It was cheap to air, and it ended up finding its audience through cable reruns. One of the most iconic parts of The Shawshank Redemption is, of course, Andy's escape from the prison. The tunnel he digs and the poster he uses to hide it are central to the plot, but here's something you might not have known. The prison exterior is real, but the interior scenes weren't filmed there. The exterior shots of Shawshank were filmed at the Ohio State Reformatory, an actual prison that had been out of use for years. The filmmakers had originally planned to shoot inside the prison as well, but the interior was so run down and dilapidated that it would have cost too much to repair for filming. Instead, they shot most of the interior scenes on sound stages, which ended up being cheaper than fixing the real thing. Here's another little-known fact. While the movie is set in Maine, where much of Stephen King's work takes place, it wasn't filmed there. Ohio stood in for Maine throughout the movie, but you wouldn't know it from watching. The empty, bleak surroundings of the prison could be from anywhere, and the filmmakers didn't need the setting to be specific to Maine for it to work. One thing that makes The Shawshank Redemption stand out is the way Andy uses posters of famous actresses to cover the tunnel he digs. The first of these is, of course, Rita Hayworth. In fact, the novella's original title was Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. Frank Darabont decided to shorten it because he didn't want people to think the movie was about Hayworth herself. But that didn't stop actresses from trying to audition for the role of Rita Hayworth, thinking she was going to be a character in the film. It's funny to think that so many people misunderstood the title before the movie was even made. If you're a fan of Stephen King, you might have caught a little Easter egg in The Shawshank Redemption. Red's prison cell number is 237, which also happens to be the number of the haunted room in The Shining, where Danny Torrance has his terrifying encounter. In Stephen King's original novel, the room number was 217, but Stanley Kubrick changed it to 237 for his movie adaptation of The Shining. It's a fun little nod to another famous King story. Let's talk about Andy's big escape. It's one of the most famous scenes in movie history. Andy crawls through a tunnel he's been secretly digging for years and finally breaks free from Shawshank. But did you know that his escape was all a matter of chance? If Andy had been placed in a different cell, one that didn't back up to the outer wall of the prison, his plan wouldn't have worked. Instead of digging his way to freedom, he would have just ended up in another prisoner's cell. It's fascinating to think how close Andy came to never escaping at all. Another surprising detail is Tim Robbins' height. At 6 feet 5 inches tall, Robbins towers over most of the other actors in the movie. In fact, his height was so striking that it affected casting decisions. For example, the actor who played Warden Norton had to be tall as well, so that Robbins could convincingly steal his suit later in the movie. These little practical considerations are easy to overlook, but they played a key role in making Shawshank the film we know and love. There are so many interesting details about The Shawshank Redemption that most fans don't even know about, especially when it comes to what could have been. For example, there was almost a different director for the movie. After Frank Darabont purchased the rights to Stephen King's novella, he received a tempting offer from Rob Reiner. Reiner, who had already made hit films like Stand By Me, offered Darabont $2.5 million to hand over the rights to Shawshank. Darabont considered it, but ultimately turned him down, explaining that this was his chance to do something really great. He wanted to make the film his way, and looking back, it's clear that he made the right choice. If Reiner had taken the helm, we might have ended up with a very different version of the movie. Reiner envisioned a film starring Tom Cruise as Andy and Harrison Ford as Red. While both actors are legends in their own right, it's hard to imagine anyone other than Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman in those iconic roles. Nobody's complaining that Darabont stuck to his vision and gave us the Shawshank we know and love. Speaking of casting, while we now associate Morgan Freeman with the role of Red, he wasn't the obvious choice at the time. In Stephen King's novella, Red is described as an Irishman with red hair, which led to actors like Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, and even Harrison Ford being considered for the part. But Darabont had Morgan Freeman in mind from the beginning. He loved Freeman's natural warmth and commanding voice, which he knew would be perfect for narrating the story. To acknowledge the original character, Darabont kept the famous line where Red jokes, "Maybe it's because I'm Irish," when Andy asks him about his nickname. It's a clever nod to King's story, while honoring the casting of Freeman, who ultimately made the role his own. One of the film's most beloved characters is Brooks, the elderly librarian who befriends a pet crow named Jake. However, working with animals on set comes with its own challenges. In one scene, Brooks feeds Jake a maggot, but this caused an unexpected problem. The American Humane Association, AHA, stepped in and said it was cruel to feed a live maggot to the crow. Incredibly, the production team had to find a maggot that had died of natural causes before they could shoot the scene. It's one of those small behind-the-scenes details that you'd never guess while watching the film. In the film, Red's past is kept relatively vague. When Andy asks him why he's in prison, Red simply replies, "I committed murder." However, the novella goes into much more detail. In the original story, Red is serving 3 life sentences for a tragic crime. He had disconnected the brakes on his wife's car in an attempt to collect insurance money. Unfortunately, his wife wasn't the only one in the car. His neighbor's wife and child were with her, and they were all killed in the accident. It's a heartbreaking story that adds a darker layer to Red's character, but Darabont chose to simplify it for the film to keep the focus on Red's redemption. One of the more surprising behind-the-scenes details is that some of the close-up shots of Andy's hands in the film aren't actually Tim Robbins' hands. For certain key scenes, including when Andy loads a revolver in the opening sequence and when he carves his name into the cell wall, director Frank Darabont stepped in to perform the actions himself. Darabont had a specific vision for how these moments should look, and rather than trying to explain it to Robbins, he decided to do it himself. It's a small but telling example of how hands-on Darabont was throughout the making of Shawshank. Here's a fun fact that not many people know. The mugshots of a young Red attached to his parole papers aren't of Morgan Freeman himself. They're actually photos of Freeman's son, Alfonso. And that's not Alfonso's only appearance in the movie. He also has a cameo as one of the inmates shouting, fresh fish today, we're reeling 'em in," during the scene where the new prisoners arrive at Shawshank. Alfonso Freeman went on to appear in other films with his father, including Seven, where he played a fingerprint technician. It's a cool little family connection that most fans don't even realize. Working with animals can be tricky, but Tim Robbins proved he was up to the challenge when it came to Brooks's pet crow, Jake. In one scene, Andy walks into the library and says, "Hey Jake, where's Brooks?" The trick was that Robbins had to time his line so that Jake wouldn't squawk while he was talking. Over time, Robbins became so attuned to the bird's squawking patterns that he was able to time his lines perfectly. If you watch closely, you can even see Robbins pause, waiting for Jake to finish squawking before delivering his line. Not all scenes are as simple as they look. Take the scene where Red is tossing a baseball back and forth while talking to Andy for the first time. What seems like a straightforward conversation actually took 9 hours to film. Morgan Freeman spent the entire day throwing that baseball, and by the time they were finished, his shoulder was so sore that he showed up on set the next day wearing a sling. Freeman didn't complain, though. He just kept throwing the baseball, take after take, to get the scene just right. Though The Shawshank Redemption feels complete as it is, there were a few scenes that were filmed but later cut from the movie. One involved Brooks' crow, Jake. After Brooks is paroled, the inmates find Jake dead in a field and give him a proper burial. Another deleted scene shows Tommy's wife visiting him, which motivates him to turn his life around and get his GED. There was even a scene where Red has a panic attack in a grocery store, which makes his decision to visit the oak tree at the end of the movie even more meaningful. These scenes would have added more depth to the story, but ultimately, they didn't make the final cut. Morgan Freeman's iconic voiceover narration is one of the defining features of The Shawshank Redemption. But did you know that the original recording of Freeman's narration had a serious technical issue? The entire track had a noticeable hiss that couldn't be removed, and the production team in Los Angeles was forced to re-record everything. Freeman, who had recorded the first version in just 40 minutes, had to spend 3 weeks in the studio redoing his lines. In the end, the extra time paid off, and the narration became one of the most memorable parts of the movie. Brad Pitt was originally cast to play Tommy, the young inmate who befriends Andy and eventually pays the price for what he knows. But just before filming began, Thelma and Louise came out, and Pitt became a household name almost overnight. Suddenly, Pitt had more opportunities and decided to drop out of The Shawshank Redemption to pursue other roles. In his place, Gil Bellows was cast. While Pitt's star power might have added to the film's initial box office appeal, Bellows brought a level of innocence and sincerity to the role that helped make Tommy such a beloved character. Another person who made a significant impact on the film was cinematographer Roger Deakins. The look and feel of The Shawshank Redemption are key to its success, and Deakins' work played a huge part in that. Tim Robbins, who played Andy Dufresne, had previously worked with the Coen brothers and met Deakins through them. When Robbins landed the role of Andy, he suggested Deakins for the job, and the rest is history. For many fans, one of the most iconic scenes in the movie is when Andy leaves a note for Red under the oak tree, guiding him to their reunion in Mexico. That oak tree became a tourist destination after the film's release. Unfortunately, it didn't last forever. In 2011, the tree was struck by lightning, and although it survived for a while, strong winds in 2016 finally brought it down. The wood from the tree was salvaged and used to create Shawshank memorabilia, ensuring that a piece of the tree and the movie lives on. The movie's title also went through some changes before it hit theaters. The original novella by Stephen King was called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, but Frank Darabont decided to shorten it to avoid confusion. He worried that people would think the movie was a biopic about the actress, and his concerns weren't unfounded. He even received audition requests from actresses hoping to play the role of Rita Hayworth, not realizing that Hayworth was simply a poster on Andy's wall. The change in title helped clear up that confusion, but it still didn't prevent a few people from showing up to audition for a role that didn't exist. When it came to filming inside Shawshank Prison, some interesting casting decisions were made for the extras. Initially, many of the locals from Mansfield, Ohio, where the movie was filmed, signed up to play prisoners in the background. But because of their regular jobs, most of them could only work for a day or two. To fill the gaps, the filmmakers recruited extras from a nearby halfway house, many of whom were ex-cons. Their presence added an extra layer of authenticity to the prison scenes. Clancy Brown, who played the cruel Captain Hadley, took a different approach when it came to authenticity. Brown was offered help from real-life correctional officers to make his portrayal of Hadley more realistic, but he turned them down. He didn't want to misrepresent the good work that most correctional officers do. Instead, Brown focused on making Hadley a truly menacing figure, becoming one of the most hated characters in the film without using any input from real-life officers. Finally, one of the most memorable sequences in The Shawshank Redemption is Andy's escape through the prison's sewage pipes. Of course, the filmmakers didn't use real human waste for the scene. Instead, they filled the pipes with a mixture of chocolate syrup, sawdust, and water. According to visitors who have toured the filming location, the pipes still have a faint smell of chocolate decades later. And with that, we've covered some of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes facts about The Shawshank Redemption. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update from our channel. Thanks for watching.